So on behalf of Water Matters, this is the 6th event that has been held, being co-sponsored. Am I on? Not on. But I don't know if it's being recorded. It is? But you can all hear me, right? Yeah, okay. So water matters. I think we all know that. It mattered a lot last Thursday night. I couldn't sleep. I just kept hearing that rain pounding and wondering what was going to happen, and knowing that as part of my involvement in Lewis Creek Association, I was due out at 7 o'clock in the morning to do our high flow event. And I think some of you also were out there then too, and many of us could not even get to our monitoring stations. That's just one of the activities that Lewis Creek Association does. We monitor for water quality using a design model that's approved by the state. And we are, on those days when we're going out, sometimes we go out at low flow events, other times we go at high flow. And we are collecting samples that go down to the La Rosa lab, which is now in Randolph. And we're collecting samples at different times. This time we went out 4 times, but so that they can test for the amount of phosphorus that's in our water, nitrogen, chloride, and suspended solids. Kate Kelly is going to talk a little bit more about that as one of the activities that LCA does. We also, our name is Lewis Creek Association, but we cover the La Platte watershed as well as the direct drainages into Lake Champlain. So it's a wide area. Wide area, geographic area, but a fairly low population that we deal with. So we have a very, I think, high percentage of people who care. And that's what this meeting tonight is about. It's about those of us who care about the water and care about the land and care about our neighbors and care about our pocketbooks. Because water quality is not only important for us, for our human health, for animal health, but also it impacts what we are going to end up spending in tax dollars to maintain our roads and maintain water quality. You know, the state has been working very hard, over the last pretty strongly, I would say, over the last 10 years, and implemented a new, what we call the Clean Water Act, and has made funding available for towns and new regulations. So there's lots of regulations that now impact the towns. So our tax dollars are now being spent to kind of remediate and do better ditching practices along our town roads. And you've probably noticed a lot of stone-lined ditches, and that is so that it will not erode the ditches. Those places that are being addressed first are the ones that are hydrologically connected to streams. So it's those ditches that most immediately enter a stream. Every ditch eventually gets to some water body, but the state has asked and mandated that we focus on those first. But really what I'd like to point out to all of you is that in Hinesburg itself, we have almost as many private roads. So those are the roads that are serving 3 or more houses. In terms of miles, we have 30, hang on a minute. It's about 30 miles of class 3 roads that are primarily gravel roads. And then we have an almost equal amount of private roads. So these are roads that serve 3 or more houses. I would say the majority of which were built prior to there being any stormwater regulations or any real consideration of how to address stormwater. Some of them were built primarily first as a driveway, and then when that landowner decided to subdivide and create 2 more lots, they might have been asked to widen it to 18 feet. Maybe, you know, they realized, oh, I better improve this road if I'm going to want to sell this lot for that amount of money. But there's very little engineering that was done. It was mostly done to keep expenses low, hiring an excavator and putting in kind of the minimum size culverts that were needed, which was pretty much the town's practice as well, because the bigger the culvert, the more it costs. And sometimes it's hard to fit those culverts in. But what we'd like to talk about tonight is what we can each do on our own driveway or on a private road, and recognizing that those expenses that, you know, maybe 10 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, when we put those driveways in, we were thinking short term. And we continue to think short term on so many of the things that we do. But it's the short term impacts, the long term impacts that will eventually show up in the roadside ditches and down in our streams. And so maybe there's the opportunity, instead of having a short driveway that went straight up, because that was less expensive, putting a few curves in that driveway may be an opportunity to slow it down. Putting in a few extra culverts. The town is hoping that they can have cooperation from private landowners so that not so much water has to continue to run down the ditch. Maybe you have a piece of land where you'd allow the town to let that water run off onto your land and be absorbed into the forest. Because as we've all learned about the importance of the 3 S's, slow it, spread it, and sink it. And that can happen along a road. It can happen in your yard within 20 feet of your house. It can happen going down your driveway. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight too. So that's a way of introducing what LCA does, but I'd also like to mention that Responsible Growth Hinesburg is also a co-sponsor and really came up with this idea of water matters, because Hinesburg is water, just like our bodies are water. I think I looked up today, 60 to 70% of our body is water. The town of Hinesburg, I would say probably 60 to 70% of the town is water. If you count the water under the ground, probably 90% of the town is water. You know, we have some really important water bodies here: Lake Iroquois, Lake Sunset, the La Platte River, Lewis Creek, the Huntington drains into the Winooski. So there's water everywhere. If we look at the historic pattern of development in Hinesburg, it's all about the water. When people settled here coming up from Connecticut, the settlers, the colonizers from there, they picked the high spots. They didn't go and build out in those wetlands. They picked the places where there's ledge and where there were small streams, and they could build dams really quickly. The Native Americans who settled here settled on the high plateaus because they could look out over the wetlands, and it was amazing for being able to hunt and setting up small dams for fishing and catching fish. So we know kind of historically and traditionally, people have not built in those wet areas. We have regulations that say, well, if you build a foot above the floodplain, go for it. Well, last Friday, you could see that was the permit that was granted for the Creekside development, and it was completely surrounded by water, and it was exactly at that line where the state person who gave permits at that time said, yep, you can build in the floodplain, just put it a foot above. So anyway, we're learning. We learn slowly, but we are learning. So I'm going to stop talking now and introduce Kate Kelly, who is the program coordinator for Lewis Creek Association, and she's going to go over a lot of the data and the information and why we collect that information on water quality. And then for the rest of the evening, if you saw the handout that we had up there, Dan Albrecht is here from the Regional Planning Commission to talk about the Tactical Basin Plan. And Alex is not going to be able to be here tonight, but it's going to allow us some extra time at the end to play with this stream table or the flume, which is a really fun, interactive thing that we can see and not get our feet wet or our hands cold playing with it. And then Jessica is going to spend a bit of time really going over the specifics of what we can do. So, yep.
Is this thing actually working? Okay. I'm not going to use it. Oh, it's recording. Okay, so I will use it. Okay, super. All right, so I just want to talk to you guys tonight a little bit about what we do at Lewis Creek Association with our water quality monitoring and why we do it. Like, who cares about the phosphorus levels in our streams? Why does that even matter? So first of all, one of the things that we monitor for is phosphorus. Okay, you guys have probably heard of phosphorus before, maybe even put it on your garden as a fertilizer for your plants. So phosphorus is really good. It helps plants grow. We need it around, but too much of it is a problem, right? We get too much of it in the lake, for example, and it causes algae blooms, and those in turn can cause fish die-offs, problems with bugs and macroinvertebrates in the lake. So we do have an issue with phosphorus here in Vermont, and it has caused some problems in Lake Champlain, among other places. So Lake Champlain is actually impaired by phosphorus, and I'm going to give you guys a few details about what that really means and why why we're concerned with it. So although I realize you probably can't read all the words up there, this diagram pretty much shows that most of Lake Champlain's phosphorus, that part in the yellow that you see up there, comes from Vermont as opposed to New York or Quebec. So most of it comes from Vermont and from non-wastewater treatment plants. So things other than our wastewater. You're looking here at, this is Lake Champlain, okay, so Quebec, Vermont, New York. Here, this little circle is Shelburne Bay. So the diagram you're looking at shows Shelburne Bay contributions essentially into the lake. And as you guys probably know, the La Platte River that starts here in Hinesburg flows down and eventually empties out into Shelburne Bay. So essentially, we're looking at the proportions of phosphorus loading or input into Shelburne Bay by land use. Overall, in Lake Champlain, about 38% of the phosphorus comes from agriculture, 16% comes from developed land, and 18% comes from stream bank erosion. In Shelburne Bay itself, we actually have a higher percent of input from agriculture, so it's greater than 50% agricultural sources. I'll just finish my sentence and I'll get to your question. A third of it is from developed land. And part of the problem there is sort of legacy phosphorus, so phosphorus that's in the soil that has been there for years and years due to like former agricultural practices, fertilizer and whatnot that's in the soil. And when it rains and all that soil erodes, gets washed down the stream and gets carried out to the lake. You had a quick question?
I'm sorry, can you tell me where La Platte is and where is Lewis Creek in Hinesburg?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, so the La Platte starts here in Hinesburg. It runs actually right out here behind, if you go behind the Hinesburg Community School, down across Silver Street. And then it travels down through a part of Charlotte and into Shelburne. It goes, where the big falls is in Shelburne, the big bridge, Shelburne Falls, so that's the La Platte. Yeah, and then it empties out at Shelburne Bay, like where the boat launch is there. That's the La Platte that empties out there.
And Lake Iroquois.
Right.
Yeah, Lake
Yes.
Iroquois is the other source for the
I'm sorry?
Lake Iroquois
Yeah.
is the other
Is the
source
other-
for the La Platte.
Right.
And then we have the other one, which is Lewis Creek, is that?
Yeah, so Lewis Creek is actually south of us. So it starts in Scottsboro, and then it runs, through a variety of towns. But it's like the watershed below ours, and it also empties out into the lake down in Harrisburg.
Would that be the one that goes through Turkey Road?
Yes.
Yes,
Turkey Lane.
yeah, correct, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good to go.
Yeah. And there are some maps over here, at least of the La Platte watershed, and, it's kind of fun to explore. So again, in Shelburne Bay, most of our phosphorus load comes from agriculture, followed by development, or developed lands, I should say, not development. And in Shelburne Bay, we have a total of about 10 metric tons per year of phosphorus loading into the lake. That's about 1.6% of Vermont's total loading. So it's not a huge percentage, but it is still, you think about a metric ton of phosphorus. I don't know if I can imagine that exactly, but it's a lot of phosphorus. So where is this stuff coming from? Like, you know, what are the sources of agricultural phosphorus, for example? Cropland is by far the largest source, and it's followed by pasture and farmsteads. In the developed land sector, back roads are actually the single largest source of phosphorus that, you know, flows from developed lands. That's primarily due to erosion and sedimentation that we talked about from those ditches eroding and not being managed properly. Impervious surfaces are the next largest source behind those back roads. In stream corridors, essentially, like I mentioned, they're eroding. We have highly eroding stream corridors, and that's, you know, carrying the soil with the phosphorus attached to it down to the lake. And finally, for forests, you wouldn't think of forests as being a major source of phosphorus. Most of it comes from erosion along forest roads and, you know, logging active harvest areas where soil is eroding. Yeah.
Could you please repeat those gross figures? 38% ag, and then the other two.
Sure. Let me go back a couple so I can make sure I quote it right. So overall in Lake Champlain, 38% ag, 16% developed land, and 18% stream bank. Stream bank erosion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. So you know, why do we care? What does this matter? Well, we have road erosion. We know that happens because we all saw it the other day. Stuff all over the place, right? Soil, roads washed out. This carries phosphorus to the lake, especially in these sections that are hydrologically connected, meaning that they're flowing directly from the roadside ditch into a stream and going to the lake. And phosphorus is pollution, essentially. We have too much of it, and so it's become not just a nutrient for plant growth, but a problem. We at Lewis Creek Association, through our sort of group South Chittenden River Watch, we monitor water quality, and this includes phosphorus and two types of phosphorus, both total phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus. So I want to give you just a little bit of background about our water quality monitoring, why we do what we do, and where we do it. And then I'll give you a few results from past years and a little bit from this year. And then we have a couple of kind of fun maps to explore. So South Chittenden River Watch began in 2004, and we sampled just at random flow times until 2014 just to establish a baseline. We sample the La Platte River, as we've talked about. McCabe's Brook, which is in Shelburne, runs sort of right along the sort of Route 7 corridor and drains out also at Shelburne Bay. Mud Hollow and Bingham Brooks, which drain into the La Platte. Thorpe, Kimball, Holmes, and Monroe Brooks, which Thorpe, Kimball, and make sure I get that right. Thorpe and Kimball are both direct to lake drainages, meaning they don't flow directly into the La Platte. They actually just go straight to the lake. Monroe Brook is up in Shelburne. And we share our data with a variety of groups. So this is actually a state mandated and shared with EPA. So we sample with certain standards that need to be followed every year. We make sure that our volunteers are, you know, trained, and we're following all the proper protocols to be able to share those data and use those data well. Addison County River Watch Collaborative is our sister group down in Addison County. Okay, so this map is, I'm sure, ridiculously tiny, and I didn't realize that you guys are all looking at my presentation view with all my notes, so let's switch off of that. If I can figure out how to do that, I'm sorry. Suddenly very tiny. Is there? Screen. Got it. Better? No. Worse? Now I can't see anything. Hiding screen? All right, well. To the left. This guy? see all slides. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's okay. I don't need to read them. I just realized you guys are seeing all, like, you can't really see my full screen, so I guess I'll ignore it. Yes. Yes. So, right. So, essentially, I just want to describe the map to you guys so that you can go over and explore it a little bit later. But we have some nice maps that were created to look at water quality within the La Platte watershed. So we sample it at a variety of stations, and this, we call it a scorecard map, shows you within these little boxes the status of various nutrients and bacteria in the water. So I'm happy to give further explanation of that later, but I think if you want to go explore and see the status of the water quality near you, you could find your house on the map and look at, for example, what level of phosphorus, is in the La Platte River near my house. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. It started all right, just not all right anymore. You can also find these maps on our website on lewiscreek.org, so you can go on there and download these and check them out in further detail. So I'm not going to go over this in a lot of detail, but I just wanted to mention that we're sampling 29 sampling stations this year. Well, we're actually done. We just did our last sample Friday. Thank you, volunteers, for going out in the flood conditions. And we sampled at both high flow and low flow conditions, and that's to get an idea of like how much phosphorus is actually going to the lake at those high flow conditions. That's when the majority of our phosphorus gets washed down or eroded into the lake. And then also we sample at low flow, and that's to be able to compare to the state water quality standards that are set at a low flow condition. Yeah.
About that,
Please.
that 80% of the phosphorus that goes into the lake is coming at high flow. And when we're monitoring at low flow, that is to understand the biological needs of the animals. So when we're talking about water quality, we're talking about both chemistry and biology. So what we want to do is ensure that there is not so much phosphorus and other nutrients that are causing the algae and that growth, but also that there's the right conditions for the macroinvertebrates, the bugs, and the fish, so that the life cycle of the animals is sustained. And so there's low flow conditions, which are more important for the macroinvertebrates and the fish population. So there's two standards that we're talking about, right? So I just want people to understand that just the chemistry part that we're talking about is one part, but then we all, not LCA, but other people go and check what's happening with the macroinvertebrates and the fish. So there's two things that we're trying to understand when we're looking at water quality. And somebody else who's more knowledgeable could explain that more, but I think it's just important to keep those two parameters in mind.
So just a quick map of where we sample here in Hinesburg. Some of our goals include looking at the loads or the amount of phosphorus that comes from the various tributaries. So as you're looking here, this is CVU Road. Okay, this is 116 going north and south. CVU's somewhere up in here. So we sample on this little tributary that comes out of the stormwater pond or the fire pond at CVU. So we're looking at what's coming out of there. We're also looking down here at where that same little tributary just before it drains into the La Platte. And we're looking here to the east of it at Patrick Brook proper, where it also comes in. So the idea there is to see where are our highest amounts of phosphorus. Like, is there a hot spot? Is there somewhere where it's like we just have these huge amounts of phosphorus coming into the La Platte? And then if we do, okay, well, what can we do about it? Where is it coming from? Can we target or pinpoint what the problem is? And if we can, then Lewis Creek Association works to develop programs and get grants to make fixes to sites. And Jessica will talk a little bit more about that, I think. But that's just one example of sort of one specific area that we're working in and doing some sampling in. I'm going to zoom past those because you don't need to see all Shelburne and Charlotte. And this year we're sampling for, as I mentioned, phosphorus, but we're also doing sampling for other nutrients. So we sample for nitrogen, sample for chloride, which obviously comes from road salt application, and total suspended solids, TSS, or turbidity, which is just a measure of how much sediment essentially is in the water. All right, so in 2018, this map essentially shows you a distribution of the mean total phosphorus in the watersheds. We have sampling stations where these triangles are. So this is sort of at the center of the La Platte. This is here in Hinesburg. This is down in Shelburne at the falls there under the bridge and heading out to the lake. This is McCabe's Brook here that runs through Shelburne. And down here we have a couple of our direct to lake drainages. So this is Thorpe Brook and Kimball Brook. And as you can see in red, most of these sites are in red. That shows that phosphorus was greater than 75 micrograms per liter. So it's essentially a fairly high phosphorus load, except for, up here in Hinesburg, we have a little bit less, between 35 and 75. We don't have all our results back yet from our water quality sampling this year, but we took a look at essentially the first 4 water quality samples we did, which were 2 high flow conditions and 2 low flow conditions. On the La Platte River, 94% of those total phosphorus samples exceeded the state standards, so not looking too good. Our single highest total phosphorus measurement was 187. And that was at LP3, which is that one I mentioned down by Shelburne Falls at that area. Our average highest was on a tributary to the La Platte that Bill and I actually sample. It runs under O'Neill Road, and it drains multiple farms, and the golf course that's up on 116 also sort of is at the headwaters of that tributary. Generally, our phosphorus increases from the headwaters to the mouth of the La Platte. And usually our phosphorus levels are higher during our high flow events. And then here in Hinesburg itself, yeah, Kate. Yeah.
On that last one, we're talking high flow or low flow, where the 94% of samples exceeded the state standards, because if I remember correctly, we're measuring against state standards only at low flow.
Only at low, right. So this is actually a combination. I didn't separate it out for that particular analysis. I will in the future when I go through and get all the data. So here in Hinesburg on Patrick Brook, we do a variety of sample stations as well. And here on Patrick Brook, about 71% of our samples exceeded state standards. Our highest average was on a tributary to Patrick Brook that runs under Mechanicsville Road. So if you're familiar with Mechanicsville, if you're coming up from town here, sort of the first major, I guess, bridge or ditch you come to before you get all the way up towards the 4-way stop at CVU. That was followed by the Patrick Canal. So where the Patrick Canal goes under 116 and empties out behind the cheese plant area. Our single highest measurement was at the ball field area, Patrick Brook, and that was followed by the tributary that comes out from the CVU storm ponds. So we're getting some interesting, results that hopefully will inform some future work that we may be doing in Hinesburg. So as Andrea mentioned, DEC, the state, does a variety of biological sampling, sort of in conjunction with this type of water quality monitoring that we do as volunteers. And they sample both macroinvertebrates and fish on different schedules. It's not every year, and at different stations. So I have a map over here that is much more easy to read than this. Essentially what you're looking at is these little circles show you condition of either bugs or fish. And red is bad, green is good. And right in the middle there, the sort of orangish color is sort of the pass-fail line. So you guys can see, for example, up here, this is McCabe's Brook. in Shelburne, you can see this whole variety of red dots over a number of years. That is essentially a failing condition on McCabe's Brook, and they are impaired. Their waterway is considered impaired in Shelburne, and that's why they're having to do a bunch of cleanup and mitigation efforts. Yeah.
Can you do a really quick description of the condition of bugs? I think you said, are you doing a count or breeding pairs?
So,
what are the...
Yeah, so I don't
details?
I don't actually do the sampling for that, so I'm not all that familiar with the actual, protocol, but I assume that they're doing like kick netting and sampling and then looking at the species of macroinvertebrates and fish that they capture.
Is who?
Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Okay. So there's like a special section within there that does all that monitoring. Can you say what macroinvertebrates are? Yes, they are invertebrates that you can see with your eyes. So large, stoneflies, caddisflies. That's the one I'm missing. Mayflies, sure. Those are the three that I don't know if that's true. Karen, do you know? Stoneflies, mayflies, caddisflies. Those are like the standard usually for Chris knows.
The ones that represent good water quality.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a quick map since we're talking about roads today. This is a map that shows roads and sort of the subwatersheds in this area. Make sure this all works nicely. This is thanks to the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Chris. Okay. Come along, little map.
158 private roads that serve about 540 parcels out of 2,000 parcels in town. So, a quarter of, right? 500 from 2,000, 540 are private roads. Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Yeah. And then there's driveways on top of that. So really we have more private roads and driveways than there are public roads.
So essentially, again, you're looking at sort of the area that we do our water quality monitoring. You've got Hinesburg here, Charlotte, Shelburne up here. We're looking at different watersheds. So the sort of greenish color, I guess, is La Platte. The pink here is Patrick Brook. You've got some of the direct to lake drainages that go directly out into Lake Champlain, and McCabe's Brook here in the dark purple. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so that you guys can see Hinesburg a little better. And we're going to click on our roads layer. We think we're going to click on the roads layer if it loads. Okay. Thank you, Internet. Well, anyways.
On the side of it, and that'll pull down a drop down and it should.
Yeah, I think it's just loading. There's a little spinny thing that's spinning. So we'll wait for it to spin. But essentially, as Andrea was mentioning, it's pretty surprising. This layer will show you the both the public roads and then the private road sections here in Hinesburg in different colors, if it ever does load. And interestingly, there's also a road erosion inventory that's been done. So on this map, you can go in and see where, sort of essentially where our roads are not meeting standards, where there's high amounts of erosion. And as a follow-up to this, I'll send you guys the link to this map. So obviously, it doesn't seem to be working tonight, unfortunately, but you can go in and sort of explore your neighborhood or your area. Yeah. Yeah.
Roads and the back roads and the phosphorus.
Yeah.
Because you had mentioned in the developed land piece that back roads were the biggest part.
So is that actual erosion of the roads themselves, or is it like the water running alongside the road?
Right. I think mostly it's like the ditches and stuff that's actually eroding. But I suppose if you had a major flood and your road was actually washing out too, it could be a problem. I think it could be either. Jessica can probably speak to that.
It's definitely both. Like, think about ruts, you know, the tread lines along the edges or in the middle of the road. That actually holds water on the road, and then the road itself can get kind of gouged out. You've probably seen those little, like, flow paths in the road surface if it's a gravel road. I mean, there used to be gravel there that's now been carried away by water to wherever it went, often our rivers and streams. So it is both the road surface and the areas along the roads and the swales. So, yeah.
All right, so I'm going to give up on the map, unfortunately. It's really cool. And
The volume of water from the road, if it gets into a ditch that then travels to a farm field especially, then it'll erode all that soil that was agricultural land, and that is the highest amount of phosphorus. Okay. So just the volume of stone.
yeah. So, you know, essentially one of the things that we want to talk about tonight is, you know, how can we manage our roads and therefore improve, you know, minimize pollutants that are running into the lake, and at the same time improve our roads and maybe minimize the amount of washouts and that type of thing that occur. And then just real quick, because I am going over here, I want to introduce both Dan and Karen, who are here to talk about the tactical basin plan. So essentially, it's just a little bit of background. The Federal Clean Water Act requires states to develop total maximum daily loads, TMDLs. That's for lakes and rivers that are not meeting water quality goals. So Lake Champlain has a TMDL, a total maximum daily load, or the maximum amount that Lake Champlain can take of phosphorus and still be able to support aquatic life and other uses. And so essentially our TMDL says that Vermont has to reduce our load or our base load going into the lake by 34% of what it is currently to meet that TMDL. The plan essentially to make those things happen is called the Tactical Basin Plan, to reduce the amount of phosphorus. And Karen Bates here with DEC and Dan Albrecht with the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission will talk to you a little bit about the Tactical Basin Plan and how that sort of fits into this bigger picture. All right, and that's all I have. I'm going to not take questions so that I don't put us too far over here. Do you guys have anything?
So I'm Dan Albrecht, Senior Planner at Chittenden County Regional Planning, and Chittenden County Regional Planning, as well as all the regional planning commissions in the state, have been supported by DEC for the last 4 years with some grant funds to help fund staff time to basically boost the outreach mechanisms and involvement of the public and especially municipalities in tactical basin planning. So our primary role with basin planning is just to support the agency's efforts to gather input and provide data. And in particular, there are many different players within the world of water quality. So we have a great local organization here that's doing great work, Lewis Creek Association, and then there are other groups around the state that help provide data. There's the natural resource conservation districts that work a lot with landowners and farm owners to get projects off the ground or provide input into water quality efforts. And then our role at the regional planning commissions is, we're not a county government. We're just there to support the municipalities. So our primary role is assisting municipalities with any issues coming up, as well as sort of providing the municipal perspective on regulatory issues to the state. So I'll turn it over here to Karen. She'll talk a little bit more about what's going on with the Basin Plan. I'm going to be passing around a sign-up list. We kind of, the way this meeting, we didn't want to, like, you can take a lot of time up talking about basin plans. We didn't really want to do that. We kind of wanted to introduce you to the process, let you know what's going on. And then if you're interested in a little dedicated sort of smaller meeting, just to focus on some of the processes of the Basin Plan and getting input into certain sections, whether it's the strategies or problem areas of the Basin Plan, I'll be in the back with a sign-up sheet. And if you want to catch me towards the end, and put your name down that, and I'll circle back at the end and talk a little bit about the timeline here over the next several months.
So, briefly, Kate had talked about the Lake Champlain Phosphorus TMDL, too much phosphorus. So how are we going to actually address that? EPA has given us a number, 34% reduction. And the way that our process to identify where we're going to do the work is that's done in the tactical basin plan. So whereas the general plan for Lake Champlain is going to talk about more the objectives, and that's in this sheet, the colored sections are basically an overview of what each sector that provides is a source of phosphorus, what are the overarching objectives, and what are the strategies to address those. And you'll see that on the second page. Then we also then get more into what the tactical basin plan is, which is to look through each section in this basin, which Basin 5, which I guess I haven't introduced yet. You know about the La Platte, you know about Shelburne Bay, but Basin 5 is a group of smaller drainages along the shoreline of northern Lake Champlain. We'd have 15 basins in the state of Vermont. Most of them are river basins like the Winooski, the Lamoille, but then we've got these leftovers on the edges. And so we call it the Northern Lake Champlain direct drainages, and the La Platte is part of that. So in this table, we basically go through each of the objectives, provide areas within the basin where that objective would probably have to be it's more important to meet that objective, and then the specific strategies. So what we'd like help with from you, either through on the back of the page here, you have my email, or you can sign up with Dan and come to a meeting, is to review and let us know, did we pick the right places for the objectives of back roads or roads? Did we talk about the upper La Platte? And that will then help us build the plan itself. So you will hear, if you'd like to sort of keep in touch with us in terms of the planning process, there's also a Northern Lake Champlain Direct Drainages webpage with the Department of Environmental Conservation, and you can just Google Basin 5 DEC and you'll get that. Okay.
And I'll describe a little bit more of the timeline here, if you guys just share these around. So the basin planning process kind of works in, see if I got there's sort of three phases. There's the planning phase, which we're in now. And then there's always ongoing monitoring that the state does. For example, the bugs and fishes, the macroinvertebrates. And then any other data it can collect out there related to water quality. So basically it's planning, monitoring, and then the most important part is implementation. So the Tactical Basin Plan helps provide a framework to guide efforts of municipalities, private groups, and landowners. Note that there's a very important group that does not do as much of the implementation, which is, it's not like the state of Vermont has like 100 field biologists and 100 river engineers and 100 water quality restoration places. They rely on landowners and partners. There's no county government either. There's us at the Regional Planning Commission, and we help manage projects and grants, but we don't have like a fleet of engineers or trucks or people to plant trees or do projects. It really comes down to those who own the land, which are private landowners and municipalities. So in terms of the planning process here, this little sheet just to kind of lay you out where we are right now in the process. Kind of begins, we're on the second page, we're in October, December of 2019, and we're at sort of the community meetings. So gain input this way. We'll be trying to touch base with the Lake Iroquois Association. The other folks, of course, that we collect regular input through is Chittenden County Regional Planning we have multiple committees. We have a Clean Water Advisory Committee, which we started a few years ago. We have municipalities represented, of course. We have partner groups like Lewis Creek Association, and Kate's been coming to our meeting. Andrea kind of kind of what hat. She wants to wear the Hinesburg hat or the Lewis Creek hat, or Marty Illick can wear the Charlotte hat or the Lewis Creek hat, and all. So we have those partners. Then we have the Natural Resource Conservation District, which does a lot of good projects, and then Friends of the Winooski River, which does a lot of work with schools, for example. So there's a lot of people to get involved, and we try to share information. Within the Clean Water Committee, you guys are lucky you're not a municipal separate storm sewer system permittee. You don't want to become one. We keep these rivers clean, okay? Because then you end up having to do a flow restoration plan like Shelburne for Monroe Brook, which is $7 million, or Centennial, which crosses Burlington, South Burlington, VTrans, and UVM, and that's, I don't know, 20, 30 million deaths. That's a lot. It's big numbers and all. And you don't have to get in a situation of forming a stormwater utility, et cetera. But the point is there's all these different actors doing things to provide input as well as do projects. So again, this is at the sort of the data gathering stage right now, and Karen will be continuing to meet with folks, and then a formal draft will come out, in the spring, and then there'll be a formal, here's the public draft, please comment, etc., things like that. And at the Regional Planning Commission, we'll review that document. Our Clean Water Committee will, and then pass information to the board. I'll pass this around. It's probably the easiest thing to do. Again, what we're thinking of is sometime December or January. December, Karen and I will organize a small meeting just to kind of dive deep into some of the tables and the charts, and did we capture all the problem areas or the new areas that we need to consider? Is there data missing? So if you're interested in potentially participating in that, we'll get your name and email, and we'll try to send out, see what kind of some options for a date to meet. First, just a one-time meeting, no long-term commitment or anything like that. So I'll pass this around, and I'll gather it up here later and stuff. So thanks for the opportunity to provide a little update.
Good. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Karen. I just wanted to kind of maybe go over a little bit of the interface between regional planning and the tactical basin planning and what LCA does, and especially with our Ahead of the Storm program. So, we're the people, we're your neighbors, members of LCA, and we've been out there collecting the data and identifying those hot spots, those places where, based on the data, based on the water quality sampling, and understanding where our rivers and streams are out of balance, where over historic manipulation things are not functioning, the rivers and streams are not functioning as they were intended. And some examples in Hinesburg of where LCA was helped to identify where if we could do some conservation or some river and riparian restoration or build a stormwater detention pond, we would help either improve the water or not allow it to get worse. So one of the very first projects that LCA got involved with DEC was on figuring out this big term, fluvial geomorphology. So we went out there with the river management program and identified what was happening with the La Platte River at the headwaters and with Beecher Hill Brook, and where it came down into the flat, and recognized that that whole area at the base of 116 when you're coming down the hill was what's called an attenuation site. So a lot of water was coming down through there, and it is a wetland, and then it had become agricultural land. But if we could allow that wetland area, those agricultural fields, to return to wetlands, that would help the sediment to be deposited. And instead of just running straight down all the ditches that had been put in that field, the stream water that was carrying sediment could overflow its banks from those ditches and eventually from the La Platte, and that sediment would go down onto the fields, into the wetlands, and be restored. So that was a project that started with LCA and then involved the conservation of all that land, basically a total of 600 acres, but 300 of those acres went to the town of Hinesburg as the town forest. And of those 300 acres, a good portion of that isn't forest yet. It's those big fields there, but there's thousands of trees that have been planted. There's a project happening with the Nature Conservancy and with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of seeing how we can accelerate the reforestation of what had probably been a historic floodplain forest. That's one example of how that was a project that was, I don't know if it was called the Tactical Basin Plan at that point, just the Basin Plan. It wasn't tactical. The other project that we did was the Silver Street Rain Garden. That was collecting all the stormwater from 116, from the catch basins that are the state road that were previously just running straight down into the La Platte. And so that was another project that was identified, and we worked with Karen and DEC to get funding to build that. The most recent project that's was part of the Tactical Basin Plan is the Beecher Hill Brook floodplain restoration. And, you know, a lot of it looks a little weird up there now after that storm last Thursday night, but it functioned. We were able to recreate a floodplain that had been, that the channel had been, it was channelized and constricted. So those are the ways in which LCA is on the ground, talking with landowners, identifying people who might be interested in a conservation buffer along the river or a project on their land that where they consider, a farmer might consider using some of their land that's beyond the road right-of-way to make an improved swale. Instead of V-lined ditches, if we can have these C-shaped swales that are grass-lined and wider, then that can slow the water down and there's not as much erosion. So we try to identify those hot spots and where there's willing landowners to do this, because an awful lot of these projects that if we're going to clean up the lake are going to rely on private landowners cooperating and doing this work. And that's what Jessica's going to talk about next. So just wanted to do a little interlude there.
Thanks, Andrea. Oh, look, Katie figured it out. Okay, so I'm Jessica Luisos. I'm a water resource engineer with Mylona McBroom, and I have had the great privilege to get to work with all of the towns around, especially Hinesburg directly with multiple projects. Got to design the stormwater system and floodplain for the Newtown Garage area in partnership with the town and Lewis Creek Association, as well as a lot of projects through the Ahead of the Storm program, which we're going to talk about tonight. And as a water resource engineer, it means I'm technically a civil engineer, but I work with water, so that's why I like to say I'm a water engineer. I fix rivers, and to do that, we work with a lot of projects actually right in rivers, restoring them, removing dams, creating connectivity between sections of river by replacing culverts and bridges that are blocking fish passage, working with communities to reduce flooding, and to do a lot of water quality projects to improve the condition of stormwater. So with that, Kate gave a great introduction to the need for water quality improvements in the watershed, and I just wanted to also say that we're seeing more and more extreme weather events that are leading to more flooding and more damages related to rivers. So whether that's more stormwater being concentrated and causing erosion on our properties and our town municipal properties and roads, or actually flooding our homes and businesses. So this is just an example of the hydrograph, the gauge data for last week's storm. So you can see, that so the river flow, so this is river flow on this axis, and days, these are each a day. So this was Halloween. Overnight, we got 3 inches of rain. That was 3 inches measured at the rain gauge at the town garage site. So here it was, 3 inches overnight. The river flow came up to a peak and then slowly came back down. So just looking at the gauge data in Shelburne, which is downstream, but a pretty good indicator, that was between a 50 and a 100-year storm. And we're seeing these more and more. Like, we're not going to wait another 50 years to see another storm like this. I mean, I've seen multiple storm events of this size, and I'm sure you have in just the last handful of years that we've been doing a lot of work in the watershed. So as part of our work as stewards and landowners, it would be great to do our part to help reduce these peak flows by keeping the water local and having it take a longer path to get to the stream. So this trend to have bigger storms and more frequent storms is really a real trend. It's been proved by all of our gauge data and our rainfall data that we've had. And this plot was put together by Climate Change Vermont and shows the trend towards larger precipitation events. So we're not in the red here. There are areas of the state that are having even higher jumps in precipitation. But in the area where we are, we're still seeing a 15 to 30% increase in precipitation over the last 60 years that we've seen this rising trend. So, a culvert or a bridge that was put in, 50 years ago is now, maybe it wasn't even designed with larger storms in mind at all, but now if you have 30% more than, what it was designed at, we really need to be thinking of the future and the future of larger, bigger, faster storm events and what we can do to mitigate that. So one of the things you can do, both for flood resiliency as well as normalizing stormwater flow and improving water quality, is to take what the Lewis Creek Association and partners have been calling the ahead of the storm approach. And this is something, kind of a general method or guidelines that you can apply on your property, whether it's your front yard, your driveway, your neighborhood, maybe a commonly owned private road. We've also applied this on town properties, like the town garage property as well. So we're going to go through exactly what that is and give some ideas about things you can specifically do. So in general, it starts by figuring out what the problem is, what your existing conditions are, and then going from there to be able to try to fix a problem. But the first step to fixing a problem is understanding what it is, where it is, and what's causing it. So an initial site assessment, a lot of times I start with a map. Down at the bottom of the page, I have a link to the VCAM's Atlas, which is a really great online tool for mapping. So you can make a base map of your property that you're interested in looking at and print it out. So you can have an aerial photo, you can have information on topography. There's also GIS information in there about where wetlands are located, where floodplains are located, or other resources you might want to specifically protect. So that's a nice way to make a map, and then taking that and really looking around your property, where is the water going? So when I do these maps, I actually draw a line with an arrow, where the water is going, where it's coming from, especially areas where water is concentrated. Like, it's one thing if water is sheeting beautifully across your lawn, nice and shallow, but as soon as you get it in any kind of ditch and it's concentrated, that water has power. And it has the power to erode, it has the power to flood, and those are really the areas you want to take the most notice of, anywhere that water is really being channelized or starting to erode. And then, you know, it's always important to think about what your constraints are. Like maybe you found an erosion area or an area where water's concentrated, and then, you know, where are the areas you could do something about that? Do you have, you know, an area where maybe you could dig out a rain garden, an area where you could spread the water back out? So thinking about where a fix could go, and about constraints. And constraints might be something that you want to protect, like a wetland, or it might be something that you need to avoid so you don't damage it, like you couldn't dig too deep over underground pipes. So having an understanding of what's on your land and how the water interacts with it is really the first step to making any kind of improvements. So just as an example, this is just a site assessment map that we did for a homeowners association as part of the Ahead of the Storm program in Charlotte. They do own this private road here that was causing some problems due to stormwater. You can see I drew arrows indicating where the water goes. There's green arrows, which are hard to see, which are the swales. There's a culvert under the road, and then there's quite a bit of erosion that was happening back here because all the water from this whole watershed drawn in orange was getting funneled into one very small culvert that was then shooting through and causing erosion downstream. So those were kind of the existing conditions that we documented in the map so that we just knew where everything was. And then as inspiration for you, before we get into the details of exactly how to do things, I have an example of some of the Ahead of the Storm optimal conservation practices that were put in this neighborhood. So an optimal conservation practice is something that you're doing that's going to address flood resiliency, water quality, a practice that's like a best management practice, but better, because you're thinking about the larger storms, you're thinking about comprehensively, not just one component of maybe water control like water quality, but thinking about the bigger picture of ecology and how it interacts with the land, really naturalizing the flow, in addition to upsizing to make sure we're considering future big storm events. So in this private neighborhood with their private road, there were a few things we did. There were some swale improvements to make sure the swales were big enough and rock lines so they weren't eroding. There was some upsizing of culverts so that the culverts weren't shooting water through. There had also been overtopping of their road multiple times, which had cut off part of the neighborhood from being able to get out, as well as some naturalized gully improvements downstream where wood was installed to be able to kind of stop the down cutting and erosion and catch some of that sediment. So it was a multi-treatment, multiple OCPs were involved here. Just as an example, so you could get an idea as to how maybe this could be applied to where you live. So so we like to describe some of the big goals as the 3 S's, and this goes over really well in schools. We've been working as part of the Ahead of the Storm program with all of the schools in the La Platte, which has been really rewarding. Kate and I have been in all the elementary schools, and well, I guess we missed Hinesburg. So if anybody has a contact in the Hinesburg school, it would be great to get in there, but we've been in the other 3 elementary schools and CVU this week, which was really nice. So the 3 S's. So Andrea did mention them. So slow the water down. You know, when it gets in a ditch and it's going fast, it's got power and velocity to move soil, move, dig up plants, whatever it's going to do to power to a road. Spread the water out. If it's spread out, it's in a much more naturalized condition and has a better chance of really being able to seep down into the ground as it would have naturally. And soak it in. So sometimes in order to soak it in, you may want to create a depression for it to be able to be held in before it's able to soak into the ground naturally. So the exact way, the practice that you use to implement these ideas might be different depending on what your site is, but you know, to keep the idea that you want to slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. Like those are the goals for the water, and that's what really naturalizes water back to what it would have been before we put our roads in and trapped water on the uphill side of roads, channelizing it where it would have otherwise been, you know, spread out in sheet flow. So as we go through this, those are the general ideas, and I have a couple of examples of things that aren't that hard to do on your own properties. So you might recognize something here that could be that you could do at home. So rainwater harvesting is a really nice thing to do. It's great for families. It's easy to put in. So this would be putting in a rain barrel or a cistern. Any roof that has gutters, this is pretty easy to modify a gutter downspout to come into a rain barrel. Sometimes your roof's big enough that you know you can actually have two or a bigger cistern. The idea is that you're holding rainwater on the spot and then reusing it, you know, either to water your gardens or, you know, I actually use it to re-wet my compost. It doesn't get rain. Well, I guess my husband, he's probably doing it right now. When I go to meetings, he uses the rain barrel to water all our indoor plants, which is quite a jungle and takes a long time. So a big concept is also limiting impervious surfaces. So impervious surfaces are any surface where when the rainwater comes down, it hits that surface and can't get through and runs off. So that would be any roofs, pavement, sidewalks. It's been pretty fun to hear the students say, you know, the playground, the ball fields, and really anywhere on their school property that puddles. So yeah, gravel roads. So gravel is impervious, even though it might have, you know, it has puddles and it might erode away, but when rainwater comes down and hits your road surface, it's not getting down through that. So basically anywhere you're parking and the water gets very compacted would act impervious. It depends how compacted it is. Usually it is. You know, there are some ways to, you know, sometimes there's like geogrids or different kinds of pavement or pavers that you can put in that have enough void space and aren't compacting the soil enough that can let water down through. So up here's an example. This is only partially in, but you can see some of the squares of concrete have been poured already and some of the forms are still waiting for the concrete. So this is a right along a river where they wanted to have like a paved hard surface, but used a pervious concrete here, which has enough voids in it so when water hits it, it's able to get down through the void spaces. So this is an option, but it's one to be careful about using because something like this, the voids can actually get clogged up with our sand and salt and grit that we typically put on a lot of our hard surfaces. So something like this would have maintenance that goes along with it. You can't just put something in and then forget about it and think it's going to work forever. So, you know, with something like this, you actually may need to vacuum it to get that stuff off of it, depending what you're putting down on it. So let's see. So a pretty neat option, we've had a few of these going around the watershed, is a rain garden, or also sometimes called a bioretention area. So the idea here is that you are digging out a shallow depression that water is directed to, and then that depression holds the water until it's able to infiltrate down into the ground and is cleaned either by filtering and or infiltrating. So these are really the best in an area where the underlying soil is a good soil that's able to infiltrate. So as the water sits there, the water is able to actually infiltrate all the way down into the natural ground. A lot of places here in town don't necessarily have those great infiltrating soils like you have up at the garage site, but have a more clay soil where water's not going to be able to get very far down. And you don't want to wind up with a situation where you just have a puddle unless you're trying to create a constructed wetland or something similar to this that you want water to sit in. So another option is to have a deep enough soil layer that you've put in so that water can percolate down and be filtered by that soil with some under drains under it that can allow it to drain out after the water's been filtered. So that is an option. You know, if you have a really high groundwater table, that might not be the best option, but you know, these are really great, and they can look really different. So there's two examples up here. One is in a family's front yard in Charlotte, and it's maintained more like a flower bed. You know, if you wanted to have like a more manicured look and fit into your landscaping. The other one is, I'm sure you're mostly familiar with the one on Silver Street, which has a more naturalized look, like more of a meadow or wetland. And they both work. They both have evapotranspiration. You know, as the plants breathe, they give off water into the air and retain phosphorus very well. Another option that's more underground is an infiltration trench. This is mostly hidden, so both things you see would not be what it looks like at the end. So the idea being that you basically dig a trench, line it with a filter fabric, then put stone in. The fabric is to keep the stone from getting all clogged up with the soils from around it. This is a great option if you have stormwater that's already in a stormwater pipe. You can kind of connect onto that existing stormwater pipe with this perforated pipe so that the water can then infiltrate kind of out of or percolate out of the holes in the pipe and down into the rock layer and then out into the soil around it. So just want to point out, this is not an underdrain. You know, an underdrain typically has the pipe at the bottom because the point of an underdrain is to collect the water, get it into the pipe so it's then piped away. This is actually the opposite. The idea of getting the water out into the rock and out into the soil. Yeah.
I have done smaller ones, and the first year I used just called Walmart landscape cloth, and it didn't hold up. And I bought geotech fabric, which was 10 times as much, but it's probably going to last 50 years.
Yeah.
So I just thought.
Yeah, so it's a good point. So there's very different types of fabric. So the one shown up here was put in, it's in Shelburne along Brook Lane, and it does use a really heavy duty, like, you know, landscape cloth. It's actually quite thick. So yeah, so water still gets through, but it's pretty heavy duty. So like as the excavator bucket, you can actually see the excavator bucket, you know, it wasn't ripping it up as they were putting it in. One, you may or may not have a roof that can hold the weight, but one other option is to actually catch and hold the water where it lands on a roof. This would require you know, special lighter soils and plants that can also maintain themselves in the drought conditions on roofs, and the structural capacity to hold all that extra water and soil and plants on the roof. But there are a lot of these around the state. This one's at UVM. There's a few more there. There's also a really neat example at the top of the parking garage at the airport. If you ever get stuck at the airport and have a little bit of extra time, it's a nice viewing parklet area up there as well, with a nice view of the mountains. So disconnection to a vegetated buffer. So this is a little less structural. The idea being that you have a paved area, whether it's your driveway or a parking area, and the water's able to sheet off of it and just disperse out into a vegetated area. This one shown here, the Hinesburg garage, also has a gravel strip that's like a 2-foot deep trench of gravel. So as water comes off the edge of the parking lot, it can kind of slow down as it goes over the gravel and start to get down into the gravel to start to infiltrate there. This is an early photo, so the vegetation hasn't come in very well, but these are ideally sheeting water off into a forested area and an area that's not very steep, because a really steep area could start to like channelize that water and cause some erosion. Yeah.
This is the town garage that they just done, right?
Yes, the town garage is like where we are, so
Right.
we're like looking out the driveway.
So with respect to this, because I live across the street from this, but that area got destroyed 3 years from a recent storm, if you're not familiar with it. So the area on the left side of the gravel was meant, I'm assuming, to put grass out there, and to catch a lot of the water. Is that, am I right? Is that what the idea was?
Partially.
It's what you're saying, kind of a vegetative area, but now it's been washed away because of the storm. In other words, all that grass they planted has now been washed away. So now they're going to want to redo that whole area again. And it's pretty, I mean, it's pretty substantial amount of damage, but the idea is to take the water and push it out onto the grass and then it absorbs in the soil and so on.
It is. So I guess I would describe it in different words. I wouldn't describe it as devastated. So the idea being there, so it's functioning properly. So the idea was that we dug down the soil. So the garage itself and all the parking lots and the storage area and the sheds were about 10 feet from the edge of the river with, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 10, or in the berms, 20 feet of fill in that area that was blocking the river from ever using that floodplain. And the river over time, because it was straightened and so confined, it had lowered and incised and dug down so that it was in a deep trough and therefore going very fast. It couldn't get out and slow down. So the project that he's describing first moved all those facilities away from the river and out of the river corridor and the fluvial erosion hazard zone, and then second, excavated, like dug out all of those berms and brought the elevation of the land down to nearer the river to recreate or restore a floodplain, so that when we have a flood, the river will be able to get out and the water can spread out and use that area. So, you know, we finished construction, finished digging it all down about a week ago. So you can imagine not much grass grows, you know, in that short of amount of time. So unfortunately, you know, it wasn't fully forested yet, and some of the topsoil has moved, but the idea is that that area was specifically set aside and created for the river to be able to use that area. And it did. Yeah. So, yeah, it's functioning properly. It's actually, I would have been concerned if the river didn't get out on it, because it would have been an indication that we didn't set the elevation properly to reconnect that floodplain. So there is quite a bit of forest creation that is going to happen there. It's actually going to happen in the spring. So, you know, when the trees are going to be able to get established. So between now and spring, we're going to evaluate if maybe some more topsoil needs to be spread around, or if the river is really in that spot, because rivers like to meander, and before it was very, very straight. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how the river evolves now that it has that space to use. And yeah, obviously it would have been great if it was already a mature forest, but sometimes there's an interim period there. So.
Or it kind of spread it out almost.
Yeah, so it did spread it out, I know. So I've been to the site a couple times since then. Yeah, so very good point. So that will be here, hopefully forest or river channel, which we'll see what the river chooses. So it's a perfect segue actually into the idea that we really need to actually protect our water resources that we have in existence. So for example, a wetland. So there's this nice wetland right in the middle of Hinesburg Village where water can safely get out of some of the channelized ditches from upstream and spread out into this nice grass area where it's able to slow it down, you know, filter some of that water and isn't flooding anything in the area. Also our floodplains. No, this is actually right across the street, Russell Farm. There's a farm right across the street. So water from behind Lampman's and you know, the neighborhoods right up there, it goes around the playing field in a ditch, and then it comes into this nice little wetland before it gets rechannelized into a stream and comes out actually right 2 properties down right next to the church over here. And then this photo is from Friday during the large flood, and It's a picture of the La Platte floodplain properly working, like allowing the water to get out onto the floodplain and spreading out right behind. So we are in this building right here, right now.
Can I make a comment on
Yeah.
that? So I think it's interesting to note that Stella Road and is the road that goes from the Charlotte Road to the cheese factory. So that road was put in somewhere in the last 20 to 25 years, right? Prior to that road, the water came under the culvert, went through a channel that was next to the ditch, and then kind of spread out everywhere in that wetland until it got to the La Platte. And in the process of building that road, that essentially kind of created a dam because there's some culverts underneath there, but they're smaller culverts than what's under 116. So that field, part of it was probably wet, but it's those small changes, those incremental changes that we make of building our roads up, and then that starts to trap the water more and undersizing the culvert, because it was so flat in there that if they made a bigger culvert there, there's really nowhere for the water to go.
Yeah, so it's a really good point. So in this photo, I'm standing on Stella Road, which is flooded. So I'm standing in a foot of water on Stella Road, looking at the field, the playing field that's flooded, and the elevation of that water was above the elevation of water in the naturalized floodplain on the riverside. And it's something we've actually seen in a lot of communities. I was talking to a few people earlier about some flooding that happened in Jeffersonville in 2011. It was the spring flooding. Route 15, in that case, acts as a significant dam and holds the water coming down the Brewster River back so it wasn't able to get out of the village over to the Lamoille River and be able to continue downstream. So since 2011, that community has done extensive work in working with their regional planning commission to do hydraulic studies and then follow up with design and using FEMA money to replace a bridge that was constricting flow and restore a floodplain next to the bridge to reduce that constriction, and then also to put this seemingly ridiculous, I got so many comments about this culvert. I'm standing out there watching the construction crew build this culvert in the middle of a dry park. It's parched, there's no water, but on Friday, that culvert was full. A 20-foot wide by 4-foot high culvert, usually high and dry, was flowing full with water leaving the village, and the similar sized storm to the 2011 storm didn't flood any homes, and it was able to, at least that size storm, get out of the village because, that was a town that, recognized that there were flooding issues, recognized that there was a road holding back water, and then, figured out what to do about it. So, maybe there's examples like that around here in town where, infrastructure is actually causing trouble. So restoring buffers and forests. So forests are really great at sponging up water. I think Andrea talked about that earlier. So, something to do in areas, especially along rivers that don't have forests, is to replant them. So these little tubes that you can see there, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but if you don't know what that is, it's a little protective tube protecting a little teeny tree so that it doesn't get snipped off by a beaver or a mower. So if you ever see them, it's a restoration planting project. So obviously you can't read this now, but if you get a copy of the presentation, you'll be able to see better what some of these design resources are. There are a lot of resources out there to help you do these projects. I know at least the first one on my list there's a copy of it over here. The Vermont Rain Garden Manual has great resource, has a lot of information on plants that are great for stormwater. So getting into roads, I separated these out just because I want to think about roads kind of collectively. As Andrea was talking about, tons of our roads are, well, municipally taken care of, and a lot aren't. So this is something that a lot of us, it sounded like 25% of the residents of Hinesburg should actually be thinking about how their road is being taken care of. Because roads have the water that lands on them and runs off, roads are also handling all the water that they're catching. Like if you have a road that's running along a slope, all the water from this whole part of the watershed is coming down and would have naturally just kept on going. But with a road, it catches all that water in the roadside ditch or swale and concentrates it. So you're now dealing with all of the water, not just from the road surface, but everything it's catching from the adjacent hill slopes. So a big piece of road infrastructure is the swales that both carry as well as potentially treat water as it flows along the edge of the road. So we've seen these in all different sizes and shapes and states of disarray. But these are two examples of kind of what they can look like if they're done properly. This one's in Charlotte. I heard it held up really well last week. This is when it was first built, but it's really nice. You can actually see the shape really well. It typically is full of very tall grasses and you can't see the shape very well. But this is what they should look like. Water being able to gently sheet off the road, a gentle slope down to a nice wide kind of parabola shaped or C-shaped bottom so that the water isn't concentrated in any kind of V and the sides aren't too steep. So what's nice here is there's plenty of room to do that, which is not always the case.
The landowner was willing to let the town do work outside of the right-of-way.
Yeah.
That's one of our problems, is that our right-of-ways are, 50-foot or 3-rod road. Sometimes we have a 4-rod road. But, that's when roads, the travel portion of the road might have been 10 feet or 12 feet. And now we're trying to accommodate a ditch, and sometimes we want sidewalks there. So it's that's something for us to consider as planning commission members, select board, and individuals. Can I allow the town a portion of my land to make, a C-shaped swale as opposed to a V-shaped ditch?
Yes, which is why I describe it as a swale, because it sounds much more like a positive piece of pleasant, well-working infrastructure rather than a ditch. It's just, I'll sometimes say ditch anyway. But so the one on this side is an interesting one where there's actually a rain garden feature right in the swale itself as well. So, swales don't have to be just boring linear, low spots. They could be spruced up. So this is actually a big problem with a lot of our roadside swales, is that swales that are steep really need to be lined with stone, because once water is contained, there's always a bigger storm that's going to have enough water in that swale that's going to cause erosion. So unless you can get the water off the road and away, like if you are going to have a swale of any length, like if it's more than a 5% slope, you really should be adding either check dams or stone lining it. So, this is an example. You can actually see some check dams right in this swale here, and this was very soon after it was constructed. You could already see that there's sediment being caught behind those check dams. So by adding some check dams, you're actually providing a little bit of extra treatment to catch some additional sediment. So there's a lot of design resources out there for roads. Vermont has made a lot of really positive strides forward in road management recently. Some of you may know that there's been a recent requirement that towns, Andrea had mentioned this earlier, maintain their roads that are closest to the water bodies. So they call them the hydrologically connected road segments. So those are the ones where water can be directly traced from the swale or road directly to a water body, and that's either a stream or a wetland. And they have to adhere to certain standards, and those standards are based on the idea that you're spreading, sinking, and soaking, not soaking on the road, but soaking off the road. So to get the water safely off the road and away from the road so that it's not causing erosion and carrying all of that sediment and pollutants straight to the water bodies. So they've created some really nice guidelines that don't necessarily need to include any kind of complicated engineering to implement them. They really just need to be able to measure your slopes, provide enough space for the right size swales and culverts, and then to actually build the practices. And there's really great guidelines through the Vermont Municipal Roads Program, and then there's some details in the Better Roads Manual that I think that could be really easily applied to your private roads, which are very similar to the pretty much exact same gravel roads that the municipalities are taking care of with these same resources. So I want to give an example from, I had to pick one, so I'm not picking on any particular road because I don't like it. I just had to pick one as an example. So Partridge Hill Road. Does anyone live on Partridge Hill Road? Yeah, I used to. It actually looks very good right now. I went out, I think they must have done quite a bit of work yesterday, you know, after the storm. So I actually have some photos from a few years ago as well. So I have a couple different iterations of what the road looked like. These roads are living beasts. They can change instantly overnight, like so many of our gravel roads saw happen just on Thursday night. So things like maintaining a proper crown, I mean, that goes out the window as soon as you plow, so, or you get into mud season. So these things need maintenance over time, but by following some of these guidelines, you can set yourself up for extremely minimized maintenance by avoiding a lot of the damage that concentrated water can create. So I think, the other point I wanted to make is that, you know, our municipal roads are maintained by a whole team of professionals with a whole garage full of equipment, and they go to trainings and they have a road budget, and you know, our 25% of our residents are now having to take on those responsibilities to maintain their road, hopefully in the same condition, you know, without necessarily having those resources. So it's actually more important, I think, for private road owners to be managing their water properly, so they're not winding up with actual washouts and the kind of devastating damage that can cost quite a bit. So in addition to water really damaging road, it can create a huge amount of sediment comes off of our roads, and it is both the road surface as well as erosion of our ditches. You know, so this is just one photo from Partridge Hill Road. You know, you have a culvert that's draining the water on the one side of the road, and you know, you can just see all this white here. It might not be super clear in the photo. This is all road gravel that this neighborhood has purchased, I'm sure, and put on their road, and has now been washed off the road surface and washed out of the ditch, and is now in this poor person's, like, well, it's more of a field, but you know, it's on someone's property now where it's not functioning as road gravel anymore. It's and you know, a lot of our discharges are not going into somebody's lawn, which might not matter all that much for water quality, but they're going directly into our streams. And even on this road, there are quite a few spots where, you know, that road gravel is going directly into a river and carrying whatever pollutants as well as phosphorus with it. So one of the first huge principles of road maintenance is sheet flowing the water off of the road. So in all spots, any water that hits the road surface should be able to take the shortest path straight over and off the road, and really off the road and into either a vegetated area or a properly maintained swale. And we'll look at what those swales look like. But anytime your road loses its crown or winds up with tire ruts or plow berms, you know, when the plow comes along and it pushes the snow off, it also pushes off a little bit of the gravel. So you can see some of that here. See how here there's this like hump of gravel, and a little teeny hump of gravel over here. These are things you would never think about, but I have walked, I don't even want to say a number, like hundreds of miles of our roads looking at this criteria and advising towns on what to do, that, you know, I have an eagle eye for these teeny little berms, and look what it is doing. You know, this might not look like much to you. It's a little bit of plow dust at the edge of the road, but all of this erosion, you know, and these get much worse, all of that erosion of the road surface and gravel that's and you know, pollutants that are moving downstream, it's happening because the water should be able to hit the road here and go straight over and off, but it's not. It's coming right down the road surface and picking up speed. So the biggest thing you can do is make sure that the water can get off the road, and that does, it does require some maintenance to get rid of, you know, maybe at the end of plow season to get that gravel back on your road surface, and doing some crown work. But a little bit of crown work and a little bit of berm removal is much less expensive than deep gouges through your entire road surface and having to repurchase all of that gravel that you're having wash off. So once the water gets off the road surface, having it in a proper swale is also very important. So this picture here is an example of what I would call an improper swale. It is deep, it has vertical side slopes where it should have a sloped, nice gently sloped 2-on-1 side slope. It is very narrow. The bottom of swales should really be, you know, at least 2 feet wide with a nice gentle shape to them, because otherwise, you know, the water is almost like shooting through like a pipe and picking up velocity, and therefore picking up dirt and pollutants and phosphorus, and making itself deeper and faster, you know, as it continues to erode down. So, you know, there's multiple things that could be done in this case. You know, maybe if you can't afford to, you know, regrade the whole thing, maybe you could put in some check dams. Every now and then put a check dam and like raise that water up so it's able to spread out and catch some sediment, and it's no longer just a straight line. Ideally, it should be regraded to a shape like this, or maybe this could actually be filled in and water would be able to actually sheet flow off past those trees. You know, I'm not exactly sure what the fix is, but it's not the best the way it is here. You know, another option for sometimes to get the water off, maybe this road is just a couple inches below the ground over here, and with a couple inches of gravel, you could build it up enough so the water can actually really sheet flow off. You know, it might be a really good investment to just raise the road up a little bit instead of like continually having the water trapped on the road and just replacing that gravel over and over. So that was a relatively low slope area. If it's less than 5%, it would be great to just be vegetated with no bare dirt. Steeper swales really need to be stone lined. So anything over 5%, there's a couple things you could do if it's over 5%. If it's over 8%, it needs to be stone lined. And if it's over 10% road, it should be large stone, like 12-inch diameter stone. One of the issues that happens with roadside swales is sometimes somebody invests in rock, but it's not big enough. So, you know, if you have a sloped swale more than 5%, you really need to have erosion stone that's 6 to 8 inches or bigger to be able to really like break down that velocity. Sometimes I've seen ditches that'll have more like grapefruit size stone, and that's really just not big enough to resist that velocity, and that'll just get moved and clog up your culverts or things like that. So making sure you have big enough stone is important.
In Dallas, it's blasted quarry rock, it's not river run.
Correct.
Can you describe that to folks?
Yeah, so it's a good point. So there's a lot of different kinds of stone out there. Rounded river rock is beautiful, but it rolls. So, you know, when you're talking about resisting erosion in steep slopes, you do want to use like the crushed, you know, kind of Andrea looks like she wants to say something. like a crushed quarry rock, which is angular. You know, they look blocky because that blocky rock is going to fit together and lock together instead of rolling over itself. So that is a good distinction. Shape is also important here too. So similar to what we were talking about with the grass-lined ones. So another piece of ditches, like swales, like when you have water, when you can't get the water just sheet flowing off of the road, which is the best, I'm going to say again. But when you do wind up in a situation where you need to have a roadside swale because the land next to your road is higher, so there's nowhere for the water to go, you need to look for spots where you can then get a break in that swale. Turnout. So a turnout is exactly what it sounds like. It's a spot where your water's coming down a swale, and you get to a spot where you can turn that swale out away from the road and get the water out away from the road and away from the swale. And, you know, ideally you're having these every 150 feet or 160 feet, because if you collect more water than that, it's just such a large volume, it's going to start to overpower your swale size and build up too much power. So finding spots, and you know, I know with towns, sometimes this requires working with adjacent landowners to find appropriate locations where water can be turned out. And you know, sometimes these do need to have some rock in them too. They also need to be cleaned out. Like this one has like, I don't know, like a dump truck full of gravel in it. Culverts. So right sizing culverts is very important. So much of our road damage is because a culvert wasn't big enough or wasn't maintained well and got clogged up, and therefore the water can't get through. So a culvert, I know it's maybe a weird term, but a culvert is basically a pipe that carries water under our roads or driveways. That's what I mean by culvert. So there are some general state standards on what they should be. You should never see a little teeny 12-inch or smaller culvert. Minimum for a driveway, 15-inch. But sometimes you really need to look at how much water you have, how much leaf debris and sticks and things are coming down, and go with something bigger. You know, you don't always want to just go with the 15-inch minimum. Under roadways, you want to definitely go bigger than that, 18-inch minimum. And for these culverts, they do need to be maintained. Like if you have a driveway culvert and it has something like this going on, this is prime for the next time we get a rain for your driveway washing out. You can see it's already over top. See this erosion coming over the top.
How do you maintain? What would you do with that?
Well, there's a few things I would do. I would figure out first where this sediment is coming from and try to address the source first. Like, why is all this here? Some of it, you can see there's some erosion on the road surface here, so the water's not getting off the road surface. You can also see some of it's coming from the driveway itself. The upstream side of this is blocked up with more sediment and leaves and, you know, some sticks and things. So, you know, after a storm, or really anytime you go by your driveway culvert, you should be looking and seeing if there's stuff like stuck in there. Because otherwise, I mean, that's where the water is supposed to go. And if it can't get in there, it's going to go somewhere you probably don't want it to, unfortunately.
That would be to build a little bit of a wall around the culvert so that the road itself is not, or the driveway is not collapsing onto that culvert and eroding.
Yeah. So adding like a stone head wall here to hold up the land around it, and also, you know, you can't tell if it's there or not because it's covered with sediment, but at the downstream end of a culvert, there should be stone on the bottom of your swale, so if the water is speeding out of your culvert, it's not churning up and eroding the soil there. So those are kind of drainage culverts. They're usually dry on a normal basis. So there's also the idea of a perennial stream crossing culvert. So these are extremely important to get right. And I would highly recommend that if you have a perennial stream crossing, that you're getting some kind of engineering help to make sure that these are the right size. There's a lot of hydrology and figuring out what kind of drainage area and flows you would expect to make sure that you don't have a situation like this one where You know, this was just on Friday. Kate got out there during the storm and was able to get this photo. And, you know, there is definitely flow up and over the road. And there's quite a few homes that would be blocked off from getting in and out of this neighborhood if this washes out, and it's very close to doing that. The other thing about getting culvert sizes right is there's a huge environmental degradation piece here. A lot of culverts that are too small are actually blocking fish and other wildlife movement. So, you know, those are things that you really want to make sure you're getting right also. So immediately downstream of that culvert, we have this very nice floodplain. So this is the stream. The stream bank is right here, and there's a nice little floodplain that the river is able to get up and access. And obviously this would be better if it was beautifully forested, but it's at least available. And there, you know, there's no house there, there's no wood pile or tank or something sitting there. So it's a nice floodplain that's at least available for the river to get up and use.
They're 1 foot above the flood elevation and put a house
Yeah,
there.
there's no home there. So this is, although not forested, still great.
Yeah.
Okay, so let us try to move quickly. So if you're going to try to do some of these things, there's a lot of things you want to think about. We went over some of these in the site assessment, really looking at the land area you have, constraints, maintenance needs, and sometimes, depending if it's a volume-based treatment, some of these things you can just do based on guidelines. Some things you need to make some calculations for to make sure you're right-sizing them. So those are things like, you know, rain garden, any kind of area where you'd be ponding something, any kind of culverts. You really want to get into the calculations and make sure that you are accommodating not only the size that you need for water quality, but also the size you need to make sure to safely pass some of those bigger storms, so you're not causing damage, you know, as those bigger storms overflow. So, you know, I have some information here about some of those other stormwater flows that you would want to be calculating for something like a bioretention area. Just to basically say that there's a lot of other hydrology that you should be considering. Anytime you're channelizing water and trying to hold it, you want to make sure that there is some calculations done behind it. So when I do this, I use some modeling programs to figure out what these flows really are. So this is likely beyond what a landowner might do on their own, but it is something that is important if you're trying to, you know, build a rain garden or something like that, so you don't wind up with some kind of big blowout. So then again, you know, the hydrology is really based on your watershed size, your land uses, and your soils. That goes into those calculations. And, you know, the idea that different types of soils have different amounts of runoff versus infiltration that takes into consideration. So depending on what kind of alternative you might be interested in, you may be able to do it on your own, or you may need some professional assistance of some kind. The Silver Street Rain Garden was one of those more advanced projects that did include design engineering, so there were survey and plans put together and modeling to make sure the sizing and the pipes and the outlets were correct. So, you know, I guess keep in mind kind of the extent of your project and how much detailed information you might need, if you need design plans or not. And then depending on the practice, you know, that additional cost for a more advanced design may really be worth it. So as we talked about with the roads, by properly maintaining them and managing your water, you can create, put yourself in a better position to avoid future costs. So one example of that is down here. So this is a private home where there was quite a bit of flooding and damage multiple times a year. The garage was flooded continuously, and it created a big ice rink that they didn't like for safety reasons. But you know, through the process of designing a rain garden, they actually have had a nice dry driveway and garage, and their home hasn't had that water damage that they had in the past. So although this was a more advanced project that did require some engineering, I think they felt like the investment was worth it for their property value and lack of damage now. So all of these require maintenance. I've mentioned some of it along the way. If you have a vegetated practice, it does require cutting the vegetation and removing it once a year. Otherwise, that phosphorus that those plants are taking up is just getting back into the water system. So by removing the plant growth once a year, you're getting rid of that phosphorus. Unclogging drains, removing accumulated sediment every now and then. And yeah, so maintenance really varies by type. And then I just wanted to give an encouragement that this is something that you really can do, whether it's a rain barrel like I have, or working with your neighbors on some road improvements. And, the Lewis Creek Association is a really great partner and resource. If you have questions, and, their Ahead of the Storm program has really helped a lot of different properties and neighborhoods implement projects. So I think that was it. Hopefully I think we're okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. So I think Jessica has time for questions. We can also have some desserts. There's one other technique that I would just like to mention on your driveways, which I think we've all seen water bars when we're walking on trails, which are usually these like little ditches and you kind of have to step through. But there's also something that that loggers sometimes use on logging operations, which is called a broad-based dip. And you can do that in your driveway as well. And so it's kind of like, those speed bumps that we've seen in Burlington, where there's kind of this hump, they put the gravel. Well, this is kind of the opposite, that you do this shallow little dip. It slows you down when you're coming home, but it's a little bit harder to plow in the winter. But you can do those on kind of a slight angle, and that will, if you have a slight pitch, even a 10% slope on your driveway, and you put one of those in, it's going to put the water over onto the side and onto the ditch. And I highly recommend them because it slows you down when you're driving, and that's a safety concern. And it's a really effective way of getting that water, and whether it goes off into the woods, or it goes into your ditch, or it goes off onto your lawn in a place where it really doesn't matter if it gets a little wetter out there. So plug for broad-based dips. Jessica, if people have questions or you want to come and explore using the stream table, we can play around with that for a little while, and lots of desserts. So anybody have any questions, or you can talk to Jessica on your own. Yeah, Kate.
Do site assessments, or do we have to hire a professional firm, or what?
We don't really do site assessments other than for projects where we've identified as a hot spot. The Ahead of the Storm process and protocol is available on the website. So a lot of what Jessica went through, you can kind of do, and really it's observation. And, if you start paying attention, just like we begin to see weeds in our garden and we recognize a weed from a flower, then you begin to really understand how the water is working in your own yard. And you can play around with it and take a shovel and direct it. So, depending on where you are in the stream and what the situation is. But I think if you live on a private road with a few of you, then it's worth talking with your neighbors and seeing about getting an engineer to come out and do a preliminary evaluation and some recommendations, and or talking to, there's many of our excavating contractors who do road work are familiar with these techniques, but it's balanced with always wanting to save their clients some money and not doing the really proper fix. But, it's thinking about making a long-term investment as opposed to, not costing as much and just doing something short-term. But you might be doing that short-term fix every other year. Okay. Anybody else? Joe?
Yes, I would just like to say that if you would like to rehear this, or just catch part of that, something that you missed, VCAM is here tonight and they filmed the entire thing and you could watch it. I felt this key. What channel?
15 or online at vermontcam.org.
Channel 15 or vermontcam.org. Telling to the audience.